Jacob Whitman slammed the glass of whiskey onto his polished oak desk, the sound reverberating through the empty penthouse. "Another empty deal," he muttered, staring at the pile of contracts in front of him. Billion-dollar agreements, endless meetings, and the same hollow promises of success. It all felt meaningless. The phone buzzed. It was his assistant, Ellen. "Mr. Whitman, the investors are pleased, but they're pushing for a more aggressive expansion timeline. Shall I schedule a meeting for next week?" "Cancel it," Jacob snapped. "I need time to think." He hung up and leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the skyline. Success had brought him everything: money, power, influence, but stripped away the one thing he craved: authenticity. No one around him was genuine. Everyone wanted something. That night, as he scrolled aimlessly through social media, a viral video caught his attention. A wealthy CEO disguised himself as a janitor to connect with his employees. The concept intrigued Jacob, but he dismissed it as a publicity stunt. Yet, the seed was planted. "What if I did this for real?" he murmured. The next morning, he called his old friend Alan, a renowned makeup artist. "I need a complete transformation," Jacob said. "Make me unrecognizable, like a mechanic or something." Alan laughed. "Is this for some charity event?" "No," Jacob replied. "It's for me." 3 days later, Jacob stood in front of the mirror, stunned by his reflection. His perfectly tailored suits were replaced with worn-out jeans and a grease-stained jacket. His hair, usually neatly styled, was now messy and unkempt. Even his posture was different, slouched, almost defeated. "Jack Willis," he said, testing the new identity. "Unemployed mechanic, looking for a fresh start." Alan nodded approvingly. "You look the part. But what's the plan?" Jacob hesitated, then explained. "I'm going to Clearwater, Indiana. There's a luxury car dealership there with a reputation for exclusivity. I want to see how they treat someone who doesn't look the part." Alan shook his head, half amused, half concerned. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious," Jacob said. By the time Jacob arrived in Clearwater, his mind was racing. Clearwater Motors stood in the heart of town, its glass walls gleaming under the midday sun. Inside, the showroom displayed some of the most expensive cars in the world. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The receptionist glanced up, her smile faltering as she took in his appearance. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone lukewarm. "I'm looking to buy a car," Jacob said. She hesitated, then gestured toward the sales floor. "One of our associates will be with you shortly." Jacob wandered through the showroom, feigning interest in a sleek black sports car. Moments later, a tall man in a sharp suit approached. "Ted Hansen, sales manager," he said, extending a hand. His smile was more smirk than greeting. "Looking for something specific?" "Thinking about upgrading," Jacob said, keeping his tone casual. "Something in the higher-end range." Ted's eyes narrowed slightly as he glanced at Jacob's attire. "We have some great pre-owned options in the back," he said. "Maybe we can find something within your budget." Jacob bit back a retort. "What about this one?" he asked, pointing to the sports car. Ted's smirk deepened. "That's a limited edition. Not exactly entry-level. Let me show you something more practical." As Ted led him away, a voice interrupted. "Hi there. Need some help?" Jacob turned to see a young woman with bright eyes and an earnest smile. She extended a hand. "Sarah Carter. I can show you around if you'd like." Ted interjected. "Sarah, I've got this covered." But Sarah ignored him, focusing on Jacob. "What kind of car are you looking for?" Jacob glanced at Ted, whose irritation was barely concealed, then back at Sarah. "Something top tier," he said. Sarah's smile didn't falter. "Well, you've come to the right place. Let me show you a few options." As she guided him across the showroom, Jacob noticed her genuine enthusiasm. Unlike Ted, she didn't size him up or make assumptions. She talked about the cars with knowledge and passion, treating him like any other customer. When Ted finally pulled her aside, his voice was a harsh whisper. "Why are you wasting time on him? Focus on clients who can actually afford these cars." Jacob caught the exchange, but pretended not to hear. Instead, he focused on Sarah's reaction. She stood her ground, her expression calm but firm. "Everyone deserves good service," she said. Jacob felt a flicker of respect for her. Maybe this trip wasn't going to be as predictable as he'd thought. Sarah returned to Jacob, her face unreadable but her posture straight. I can show you a few other models, or we can discuss financing options if you're ready. Jacob nodded, curious to see how far her professionalism would go in the face of obvious tension with her boss. Let's keep looking. I've got time. They moved to another section of the showroom, where the higher-end SUVs were displayed. Sarah spoke with a balance of detail and passion that Jacob hadn't expected. She didn't just recite specs. She talked about what made the vehicle special, even highlighting features she thought would make them practical for someone starting over. It wasn't condescending, though. It felt genuine, almost thoughtful. "You seem to really care about these cars," Jacob said, testing her response. Sarah laughed softly. "Well, when you spend enough time around them, it's hard not to. But honestly, I just love the challenge of finding the right fit for someone. It's like solving a puzzle." Jacob studied her for a moment, impressed. She wasn't selling for commission. She truly enjoyed the process. But before he could reply, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Sarah, a moment." Ted was standing by the corner office, gesturing for her to come over. She shot Jacob an apologetic look. "I'll be right back." Jacob watched as Sarah approached Ted. Their conversation was muted, but the body language was clear. Ted was frustrated, leaning in and gesticulating sharply, while Sarah stood stiffly, her hands clasped in front of her. Whatever Ted was saying, it was obvious he was unhappy with how she was handling Jacob. Ted finally waved her off, his expression one of annoyance. Sarah returned to Jacob, her smile intact but slightly strained. "Sorry about that. Where were we?" Jacob tilted his head. "You're a lot more patient than I'd be." Sarah hesitated, then shrugged. "I've learned to pick my battles." They resumed their tour of the showroom, but Jacob's focus had shifted. Ted's treatment of Sarah had left a sour taste in his mouth. He couldn't decide whether it was because Ted had judged him so harshly or because Sarah clearly deserved better. Either way, Jacob's plan was starting to take shape. He decided to push the envelope. "What's the most expensive car you've got?" Jacob asked suddenly. Sarah blinked, caught off guard. "The most expensive? Well, that would probably be the Platinum Edition Phantom. It's in the VIP room." "Let's see it," Jacob said. Sarah hesitated. "That's usually reserved for pre-qualified buyers. But if you're serious, I can." "Why not?" Jacob interrupted, giving her an encouraging smile. "I've always wanted to see what the best looks like." Sarah hesitated again but nodded. "All right, give me a minute." She disappeared into the back, leaving Jacob alone with his thoughts. Moments later, she returned with a keycard and gestured for him to follow her. They passed through a discreet door into a private viewing room where the Platinum Edition Phantom sat under soft lighting, its sleek curves and polished surface gleaming like a jewel. "Here it is," Sarah said, her voice tinged with pride. "The pinnacle of luxury. Handcrafted interior, fully customizable features, and an engine that's as smooth as it is powerful." Jacob circled the car slowly, nodding in approval. "It's impressive. What's the price tag?" "Just over $500,000, Sarah replied. Jacob chuckled. "That's ambitious." "Well," Sarah said, her tone light but professional, "it's not for everyone. But for those who can afford it, it's worth every penny." Before Jacob could respond, Ted appeared in the doorway, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "What is this?" he demanded. "Sarah, why is he in here?" Sarah squared her shoulders. "He asked to see the Phantom." Ted turned to Jacob, his voice dripping with disdain. "This isn't a museum. That car is for serious buyers, not looky-loose." Jacob met Ted's gaze, his expression calm. "I didn't realize there were rules about who could look at what." "There are," Ted snapped, "and they're pretty clear. If you can't afford it, you don't waste our time." Jacob raised an eyebrow, noting Sarah's subtle wince. "Interesting policy," he said. "I'll keep that in mind." Ted turned back to Sarah. "My office." "Now." Sarah glanced at Jacob apologetically, then followed Ted out of the room. Jacob lingered by the car, his mind racing. Ted's hostility had crossed a line. and Sarah's quiet dignity in the face of it only reinforced Jacob's resolve. He needed to know more about her story. Something told him she was the key to making this experiment mean something. Jacob lingered near the showroom after Sarah disappeared into Ted's office. The conversation inside was heated, though their voices were low enough that he had to strain to catch fragments. Ted's tone carried a sharp edge, the kind of voice that cut through someone's resolve like a blade. Sarah's responses, though quieter, were steady. Jacob couldn't make out every word, but the energy was unmistakable. Ted wasn't happy with her decision to show him the high-end car, and she wasn't backing down easily. When Sarah returned, her shoulders were set in a way that suggested she was holding tension tightly, refusing to let it show on her face. She offered him a professional smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. Jacob could see the effort it took for her to stay composed. "Sorry about the wait," she said, as though nothing unusual had happened. "Where were we?" Jacob pretended not to have noticed the confrontation. "I think we were talking about what kind of options the car has. I'm curious, what's included at that price point?" She nodded and began explaining the features of the luxury vehicle in detail, her professionalism unwavering. But Jacob wasn't really listening. His mind was focused on her resilience, on the way she stood firm despite Ted's obvious disapproval. It wasn't just about selling a car to her. It was about treating people with respect, even when her job and her dignity were on the line. As they walked back through the main showroom, Jacob asked, "How long have you been working here?" 2 years, Sarah replied, her tone even. "It's not my dream job, but it pays the bills." Jacob studied her for a moment, sensing there was more to the story. "What would you rather be doing?" Sarah hesitated, then offered a small, self-deprecating laugh. "Honestly, I'd love to work in marketing. Maybe for a company that does something meaningful, like sustainable energy or nonprofit work. But that's a long way off right now." "Why's that?" Jacob asked, keeping his tone light. "It's just not the right time," she said. "My mom's health isn't great, and my little brother is still in school. Between their needs and my own, college isn't an option for me right now. But it's okay. I'll get there eventually." Her words struck a chord in Jacob. There was no self-pity in her tone, just a quiet acceptance of her reality. It reminded him of something he'd lost over the years, a sense of purpose that went beyond ambition. Sarah wasn't chasing success for the sake of it. She was fighting for something bigger than herself. As they moved to another section of the showroom, Jacob noticed how the other employees interacted with her, or rather, how they didn't. Sarah seemed isolated, the kind of person who was too earnest for an environment built on appearances and profit margins. The other salespeople exchanged quick glances as she walked past, their dismissiveness subtle but clear. Even the customers seemed to overlook her, gravitating toward the flashier employees who radiated an air of exclusivity. By the time they reached the last car on the floor, Jacob had seen enough to confirm what he suspected. The dealership wasn't just exclusive. It thrived on judgment, on an unspoken hierarchy that placed people like Ted at the top and Sarah at the bottom. And yet, Sarah refused to conform to it. She treated everyone with the same respect, whether they were wearing a tailored suit or a grease-stained jacket. When they reached the exit, Sarah handed him a folder with her card tucked neatly inside. "Thanks for stopping by today," she said. "If you have any questions or need more information, feel free to call or email me." Jacob took the folder but didn't glance at it. Instead, he met her gaze. "Thank you, Sarah. I mean it." For a moment, her professional mask slipped, and he saw a flicker of genuine warmth in her expression. "Take care, Jack," she said softly. As he stepped into the cool evening air, Jacob felt a surge of determination. What had started as an experiment, a way to test the authenticity of others, was now something more personal. Sarah wasn't just a variable in his little social test. She was a real person with dreams, struggles, and an unwavering sense of integrity. She deserved better than this place, better than people like Ted. Jacob climbed into his rented pickup truck, his mind racing with ideas. He pulled out his phone and opened a blank note. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he began typing, outlining a plan that was beginning to take shape in his mind. He would raise the stakes tomorrow, push the limits, and see just how far people like Ted could be provoked. But more importantly, he would find a way to help Sarah, to make sure her kindness and resilience didn't go unrewarded. As he saved the note and started the engine, the dealership's lights glinted in his rearview mirror. Tomorrow, he thought, would be different. The next morning, Jacob arrived at Clearwater Motors determined to push the boundaries further. He stepped through the glass doors, his worn-out boots clunking against the polished floor. The receptionist glanced up from her desk, her expression flickering with faint recognition before returning to indifference. "Morning," Jacob said casually, giving a small wave. He noticed her pause before muttering a quick greeting and returning to her screen. The air was colder than yesterday, not physically, but in the way people reacted to his presence. Jacob liked that. It meant his cover was holding. He spotted Sarah near the back of the showroom, standing by a line of mid-sized sedans, talking to a young couple. She gestured animatedly toward one of the cars, her demeanor as approachable as ever. Jacob didn't interrupt. Instead, he walked the showroom, pretending to inspect vehicles, knowing full well he wasn't fooling anyone who had already judged him. The sales manager, Ted, spotted him almost immediately. Ted's sharp eyes narrowed, and he strode across the showroom floor with the kind of urgency reserved for problems that needed swift removal. Jacob feigned oblivion, leaning slightly into a convertible and tapping the leather seat. "You're back," Ted said, his voice clipped. "What can we do for you today?" Jacob straightened, offering a smile that he knew would grate on Ted. "I've been thinking about that Phantom you showed me yesterday." Ted's lips tightened. "That car isn't—" I know, Jacob interrupted, raising his hands as if conceding. "It's not for everyone, but I couldn't get it out of my head. I thought I'd come back and take another look." Ted looked as though he was holding back a groan. "Mr. Willis, I'm sure you're aware that vehicles of that caliber require more than just interest. There's a process." "Sure," Jacob said easily, cutting him off again. "But a guy can dream, right?" Ted stared at him, his jaw tightening with visible frustration. Just as he opened his mouth to respond, Sarah approached, her expression neutral but her posture tense. "Morning, Jack," she said, her tone warm despite the tension in the air. "Back so soon?" "Couldn't stay away," Jacob replied with a grin. "Figured I'd pick your brain a bit more." Ted's irritation was palpable. "Sarah, I've got this handled," he said curtly. Sarah's eyes flicked between the two men, and for a moment, it seemed like she might back off. But then she squared her shoulders and said, "Jack and I were already working together yesterday. I'd be happy to help him again today." Ted's nostrils flared, but he didn't argue further. "Fine. Just don't waste too much time," he said before walking off, muttering something under his breath. Sarah turned back to Jacob, her smile faint but genuine. "What can I do for you today?" Jacob leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice. "You didn't have to do that." She shrugged. "It's my job." "No, it's more than that," Jacob said, holding her gaze. "Most people wouldn't bother sticking their neck out, especially not for someone like me." Sarah hesitated, then said, "Maybe most people aren't in the right job." Jacob chuckled softly. "Fair enough. But since you're stuck with me, let's take another look at that Phantom. If nothing else, I'd like to hear more about it." Sarah led him back to the VIP section without a word, her steps steady despite the weight of Ted's disapproval lingering in the air. As they approached the gleaming car, she started explaining its features again, her voice calm and knowledgeable. Jacob listened, but his focus was elsewhere. He was watching how she carried herself, how she seemed to rise above the petty judgments of others, even when they tried to drag her down. As Sarah wrapped up her explanation, Jacob said, "You're good at this?" She blinked, surprised. "At what?" "At not letting people get to you," Jacob said. "Ted, the other salespeople, even some of the customers, they don't treat you like they should. But you don't let it show." Sarah sighed softly, leaning against the car. "It's not always easy," she admitted. "But I can't let that stop me. People like Ted, they're just part of the job. The way I see it, the only person's opinion I can control is my own." Jacob nodded, impressed by her perspective. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," he said, "and a hell of a lot of patience." Sarah smiled, a genuine one this time. "Thanks, Jack. I appreciate that." Jacob didn't linger long after that. He knew he'd already drawn enough attention, and he didn't want to make things harder for Sarah. But as he left the dealership, his mind was spinning with ideas. Sarah's resilience wasn't just admirable, it was inspiring. She wasn't just another test subject in his little experiment. She was someone worth fighting for. Jacob arrived at the dealership earlier the next morning, determined to escalate the stakes. He stepped inside just as the staff was finishing their morning briefing. Ted stood at the center, delivering what sounded like another lecture about maximizing profit margins. His words carried the same dismissive tone Jacob had come to expect, laced with a self-importance that set the tone for the entire room. The employees began to disperse, most heading off to their respective posts. Jacob caught sight of Sarah near the corner, quietly organizing a set of brochures. She looked up as he approached and offered him a polite nod, though there was a flicker of surprise in her expression. "Back again?" she asked, her voice steady, though her smile hinted at cautious curiosity. "Couldn't resist," Jacob said, holding up the folder she'd given him the day before. "Still thinking about my options." Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You seem pretty serious about this." Jacob shrugged. "I like to take my time with big decisions." Before Sarah could respond, Ted appeared at Jacob's side, his presence as unwelcome as ever. "Mr. Willis," he said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Still shopping around, I see." Jacob turned to him, keeping his expression deliberately casual. "Sure am. Sarah's been a great help." Ted's eyes flicked to Sarah, his annoyance thinly veiled. "I'm sure she has. But maybe we should focus on something more in your range today. No need to waste time on what's out of reach." Jacob didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. "Out of reach? That phantom's been on my mind all night. You'd be surprised what people like me can manage." Ted's expression hardened, the professional veneer cracking slightly. "People like you?" he repeated, his tone bordering on a sneer. Sarah stepped in before the conversation could spiral further. "Jack, why don't we take another look at the options we discussed yesterday?" she said, her voice calm but firm. Ted opened his mouth to interject, but Sarah didn't give him the chance. "I'll handle this, Ted," she added, a quiet authority in her tone that made Jacob take notice. Ted hesitated, clearly unhappy, but eventually stepped back, muttering something under his breath as he walked away. Jacob watched him go before turning back to Sarah, who was already gesturing for him to follow her toward the showroom floor. "You didn't have to do that," Jacob said once they were out of earshot. Sarah glanced at him. "Do what?" "Steppin' like that," he replied. "Ted doesn't seem like the type to take it lightly." Sarah's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Let me worry about Ted. My job is to help customers, not play favorites." Jacob nodded, though he couldn't help but feel a growing admiration for her composure. They spent the next hour revisiting several cars, with Sarah offering the same thoughtful explanations she always did. Jacob asked more questions than usual, testing her knowledge and patience, but Sarah handled it all effortlessly. As they were wrapping up, Jacob said, "What would you do if you weren't here? If money weren't an issue?" Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in the conversation. "I'm not sure I follow." "You've got the skills for something bigger," Jacob said. "And I'm guessing this place isn't your endgame." Sarah hesitated, her expression softening slightly. "If I could, I'd go back to school, get a degree in marketing, maybe work for a company that makes a difference. But that's not in the cards right now." "Why not?" Jacob pressed. She gave a small shrug, her gaze dropping briefly. "Life doesn't always line up the way you want it to. My mom's health hasn't been great, and my brother's still in high school. They need me to keep things steady, and this job helps me do that." Jacob nodded, sensing there was more to the story but deciding not to push. "You ever think about taking a leap anyway?" Sarah met his gaze, her smile faint but sincere. "I think about it every day, but sometimes doing the right thing means putting other people first." Her words lingered in Jacob's mind long after he left the dealership that day. He'd come here to test the authenticity of others, to see how people would treat someone they deemed insignificant. But Sarah was proving to be more than just authentic. She was selfless in a way Jacob hadn't expected. Driving away, Jacob felt the familiar tug of determination. He wasn't done yet. Tomorrow, he'd take things further. Not for the experiment anymore, but for Sarah. Because if there was anyone who deserved a break, it was her. And Jacob had the means to make it happen. The next morning, Jacob arrived at the dealership just as the staff was unlocking the doors. He'd chosen this timing deliberately, wanting to catch Ted and the other employees off guard. This was the day he planned to take things up a notch, and he needed to ensure every detail landed exactly as intended. As he stepped into the pristine showroom, the receptionist barely glanced at him, her focus on her computer. Jacob walked past her without a word, heading straight for the luxury section. The vehicles gleamed under the soft overhead lights, and he allowed himself a moment to admire the craftsmanship. He wasn't here for the cars, though. This was about people. He spotted Ted near the back, standing in his usual commanding posture, clipboard in hand as he barked orders at a junior salesman. Ted's gaze flicked to Jacob, and his face immediately darkened. "You're back." "Again," Ted said, his tone as sharp as ever. "I'm starting to wonder if you're lost or just bored." Jacob smiled, unaffected by the hostility. "Neither," he said. "I'm here to finalize some decisions." Ted snorted. "Unless those decisions involve a car that's actually in your price range, I suggest you stop wasting everyone's time." Jacob tilted his head, deliberately dragging out the silence before responding. "You know, it's funny how quick you are to decide what someone can and can't afford." Ted's expression hardened, but before he could reply, Sarah appeared. Her timing was impeccable, her steps purposeful as she approached the two men. "Morning, Jack," she said, her tone warm but professional. She gave Ted a quick glance, her demeanor neutral. "Ready to dive in?" Ted crossed his arms, his frustration simmering just below the surface. "Sarah, you don't have to. I've got it." Sarah cut in smoothly, her voice steady. "Thanks, Ted." Jacob didn't miss the way Ted's jaw tightened before he stalked off, muttering under his breath. He turned to Sarah, impressed by how effortlessly she handled the tension. "You've got a knack for defusing situations," he said as they moved toward one of the high-end SUVs. Sarah gave a small shrug. "Part of the job. Now, what can I help you with today?" Jacob paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room before landing on her. "Actually, I've got a bit of a curveball for you." Her brow furrowed slightly. "A curveball?" "Yeah," Jacob said, slipping his hands into his pockets. "What if I told you I wasn't just looking for a car?" Sarah tilted her head, curiosity flickering across her face. "What are you looking for, then?" Jacob took a step closer, his voice lowering slightly. "I'm looking to see how people treat someone they think doesn't matter." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Jacob could see the flicker of realization in Sarah's eyes. She didn't react immediately, though. Instead, she studied him, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "And what have you found so far?" she asked. Jacob smiled faintly. "A lot of things, but the most interesting one is standing right in front of me." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in quiet calculation. "You've been testing us," she said, her tone more curious than accusatory. "Something like that," Jacob admitted. "But it's not what you think. I didn't come here to embarrass anyone or prove a point. I came here to understand." Sarah crossed her arms, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "And what exactly are you trying to understand?" Jacob hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "How people act when they think no one's watching. Who they really are when the stakes are low, and the rewards aren't obvious." Sarah nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "And? What do you think of what you've seen?" Jacob's smile softened. "I think you're the exception." Her expression shifted, a flicker of surprise breaking through her composure. "The exception?" Jacob nodded. "You treat everyone with the same respect, no matter what they look like or how much money they have. You don't let the pressure get to you, and you don't let people like Ted dictate your worth." "That's rare." Sarah didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter, more reflective. "I just try to do what feels right. That's all." Jacob studied her for a moment, then said, "And that's exactly why you deserve more than this place." The statement hung in the air, heavier than anything Jacob had said so far. Sarah blinked, clearly taken aback, but before she could respond, a voice called out from across the showroom. "Sarah, Ted's voice cut through the moment, sharp and commanding. "What are you doing? There are real customers waiting." Sarah glanced over her shoulder, her expression tightening briefly before she turned back to Jacob. "I should get back to work," she said, her voice polite but tinged with something else, an unspoken understanding. Jacob nodded. "Of course. But this isn't over." As Sarah walked away, Jacob felt a surge of determination solidify into something more concrete. She was worth the risk, worth every effort he was about to make. Ted and the rest of the dealership wouldn't see it coming, and when they did, it would be too late. Jacob returned to the dealership that afternoon, his plan fully formed. He strode in with a purpose, his usual casual demeanor replaced with a quiet intensity. Ted was by the reception desk, leaning over a clipboard, barking instructions to an employee who nodded nervously. When Ted spotted Jacob, his face darkened, his frustration barely hidden. "Back again?" Ted's voice was sharp, his patience clearly worn thin. "I thought we were clear about—" Jacob raised a hand to cut him off, his calm, deliberate tone leaving no room for argument. "I'd like to speak to the owner of this dealership." Ted blinked, caught off guard by the sudden demand. "The owner?" he repeated, his voice faltering for the first time. "Why would you need to speak to him?" Jacob's gaze didn't waver. "Because I'm done wasting time. Either you make the call or I will." Ted hesitated, torn between annoyance and uncertainty. He clearly didn't want to comply, but something in Jacob's tone made him pause. Finally, he muttered something under his breath and pulled out his phone, walking away as he dialed. Jacob turned back to the showroom, scanning the room for Sarah. She was near the entrance, helping an older man navigate the features of a mid-size sedan. Her demeanor was as professional as ever, her focus entirely on the customer. Jacob waited until she finished before approaching, his voice low when he spoke. "Sarah," he said, and she looked up, her expression shifting to one of cautious curiosity. "Jack," she said, "did you find what you were looking for?" "In a way," Jacob replied, "but I need your help with something." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Help with what?" Jacob leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Trust me on this. Just go along with what happens next." Sarah's confusion deepened, but before she could respond, Ted's voice boomed across the showroom. "Mr. Willis," he called, his tone dripping with false courtesy. "The owner is on his way. You'll be able to speak with him shortly." Jacob straightened, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Perfect. The next 15 minutes passed in a blur. Employees whispered among themselves, exchanging curious glances as they speculated about why Jacob, a man they'd written off as insignificant, had demanded to see the owner. Even Sarah seemed unsure, though she stayed close, watching the situation unfold with quiet interest. When the owner, a tall man in his 60s with a polished demeanor, finally arrived, Ted intercepted him, gesturing toward Jacob with a mix of irritation and confusion. Jacob stepped forward, his confidence unwavering. "Mr. Caldwell," Jacob said, addressing the owner directly, "thank you for taking the time." Caldwell glanced at Ted, then back at Jacob. "I understand you wanted to speak with me. What's this about?" Jacob took a deep breath, the moment of truth upon him. "It's about this dealership, how it's run, how customers are treated, and what it represents." Ted's expression darkened. "If this is some kind of complaint—" Jacob held up a hand, silencing him without a word. Caldwell's gaze sharpened, his curiosity clearly piqued. "Go on," Caldwell said. Jacob nodded. "I've been coming here for days, observing how things operate. I've seen how judgments are made, how certain customers are dismissed without a second thought, and how the culture here prioritizes appearances over integrity." Ted bristled. "This is ridiculous. You've been wasting our time." "Enough," Caldwell said, his tone firm. Ted fell silent, though his glare remained fixed on Jacob. Jacob continued, his voice steady. "Not everyone here operates that way. There's one person, Sarah, who treats every customer with the same respect, regardless of how they look or what they might be able to afford. She's the reason I kept coming back, because she's the exception." Sarah's eyes widened, her confusion giving way to shock as she realized she was the focus of Jacob's words. Caldwell turned his attention to her, his expression thoughtful. Jacob wasn't finished. But the rest of the staff, including your manager, operate under the assumption that they can decide someone's worth at a glance. That's not just bad business. It's bad humanity. Caldwell crossed his arms, his gaze narrowing as he processed Jacob's words. "And you are?" he asked. Jacob hesitated for the briefest moment before responding. "My name is Jacob Whitman. I own a number of businesses across the country, and I came here to see how people treat someone they think is insignificant. What I found is a problem, but also an opportunity." The room fell silent, the weight of Jacob's words settling over everyone present. Caldwell looked at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I see." Ted, however, wasn't finished. "This is outrageous. He's been pretending to be a customer, and he found something we need to address," Caldwell interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Ted, we'll discuss this later. For now, I'd like to hear more from Mr. Whitman." Jacob glanced at Sarah, her expression still a mixture of shock and disbelief. He gave her a small, reassuring nod before turning back to Caldwell. This was only the beginning. The room remained quiet, the tension thick as Caldwell gestured toward his office. "Let's talk privately," he said to Jacob. His voice was calm but firm, commanding attention without raising it. Jacob nodded, following him across the showroom, aware of every pair of eyes watching their movements. As Jacob entered Caldwell's office, he noticed the understated elegance of the space. Dark wood furniture, framed certificates on the walls, and a clean, uncluttered desk. Caldwell shut the door behind him, his expression unreadable as he took a seat and gestured for Jacob to do the same. "Now," Caldwell began, folding his hands on the desk, "why don't you tell me exactly what brought you here and what you hope to achieve?" Jacob leaned back in the chair, meeting Caldwell's gaze. "I've spent years building businesses, some small, some massive. Along the way, I've seen a pattern. The way organizations treat people, whether they're customers or employees, says more about their culture than any mission statement ever could." Caldwell nodded slowly but didn't interrupt. "I came here posing as someone who doesn't fit the typical profile of your clientele," Jacob continued. "I wanted to see how I'd be treated and whether your staff would measure me by my character or my wallet. What I found wasn't surprising, but it was disappointing." Caldwell's jaw tightened, though he remained silent. Jacob pressed on. "Your sales manager, Ted, embodies everything wrong with this dealership. He assumes the worst about people based on appearance and discourages others from doing anything that might challenge his worldview. That kind of attitude might work short-term, but it's toxic. It damages your brand and, more importantly, your people." Caldwell exhaled slowly, his brow furrowing. "And you believe this assessment is based on a few days of observation?" Jacob gave a faint smile. "It's based on years of seeing this exact behavior repeated in businesses across industries. This isn't unique to Clearwater Motors, but it's clear you've allowed a culture to take root here that prioritizes image over substance." Caldwell leaned back, considering Jacob's words. "You've made your point about Ted, but you also mentioned Sarah. What about her?" Jacob's expression softened slightly. "Sarah is the opposite of Ted. She treats every customer with respect, regardless of how they look or what they might be able to afford. She doesn't let the pressure or the environment get to her. In fact, she rises above it. That's the kind of person who should represent your business." Caldwell nodded, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "And what do you propose I do about all this?" Jacob leaned forward, his tone decisive. "First, you need to evaluate Ted's role here. He's not just bad for customers, he's bad for morale. Second, you need to reward people like Sarah who go above and beyond. And third, you need to reconsider how you measure success. It's not just about sales numbers. It's about reputation, loyalty, and the long-term health of your business." For a moment, Caldwell didn't respond. He simply studied Jacob, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "You're not an ordinary customer, are you?" Jacob allowed himself a small smile. "No, I'm not." Caldwell nodded slowly, then stood. "You've given me a lot to think about. I'll need time to process it." Jacob rose as well, extending a hand. "Fair enough, but don't take too long." Every day this culture persists is another day you're losing potential, both in your team and your customers. Caldwell shook his hand, his grip firm. I appreciate your honesty, and I'll be in touch. Jacob left the office feeling a sense of closure. The ball was now in Caldwell's court, but Jacob wasn't finished. As he walked through the showroom, his eyes met Sarah's. She was standing near the entrance, her expression cautious but curious. Everything okay? She asked as he approached. Jacob stopped, offering her a reassuring smile. Better than okay. Just give it a little time. Sarah frowned slightly but nodded. If you say so. As Jacob stepped outside, the sun breaking through the clouds, he felt a surge of determination. His role in this was shifting. What had started as an experiment was now a mission, not just to expose the flaws in the system, but to ensure that people like Sarah got the recognition they deserved. He wasn't just walking away from the dealership. He was walking toward a resolution, and Sarah was at the heart of it. Jacob spent the next few hours considering his next move. He knew that speaking with Caldwell wasn't enough. Actions would speak louder than words. If this dealership was going to change, it needed a moment that forced everyone involved to see the truth, and Sarah needed to be at the center of that moment. The next morning, Jacob arrived at Clearwater Motors earlier than ever, even before the employees began to filter in. He stood outside in the brisk morning air, leaning casually against his rented truck as the first of the staff trickled in. Most gave him curious looks, but no one approached him. Then, at exactly 8:45, Sarah arrived. She parked her modest sedan a few spaces away and stepped out, her bag slung over her shoulder. When she saw Jacob, her expression shifted to one of surprise and faint concern. Jack? She called as she approached. You're here early. Jacob straightened, giving her a warm smile. Couldn't wait. Sarah looked at him skeptically. Wait for what? You'll see, Jacob said cryptically. Trust me. Before Sarah could press him further, Ted's car pulled into the lot. He stepped out, his face already set in a scowl when he saw Jacob. Ted approached with his usual swagger, his voice sharp and impatient. What are you doing here again? Ted demanded. I thought we made it clear. You're going to want to be on your best behavior today, Ted, Jacob said evenly, his tone carrying an edge that silenced the manager. Big things are happening. Ted's scowl deepened, but he didn't respond, clearly unsure how to handle the shift in Jacob's demeanor. Sarah, meanwhile, looked between the two men, her unease growing. Jack, she said softly. What's going on? Jacob turned to her, his expression softening. Just trust me, and don't let anyone talk down to you today. Not Ted, not anyone. Before Sarah could respond, Caldwell's car pulled into the lot. The dealership owner stepped out, his movements brisk and purposeful as he headed toward the entrance. He caught sight of Jacob and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, though his expression remained unreadable. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tension. Jacob lingered in the showroom, watching and waiting as the staff went about their routines. Ted avoided him as much as possible, though his irritation was obvious in every glance he threw Jacob's way. Sarah, meanwhile, carried on with her usual professionalism, though Jacob could see the questions in her eyes every time their paths crossed. Then, shortly after lunchtime, Caldwell called for an impromptu staff meeting. The announcement sent a ripple of surprise through the employees, who gathered near the center of the showroom, murmuring among themselves. Jacob stood off to the side, his arms crossed as he observed the scene. Caldwell stepped forward, his expression calm but authoritative. I've been taking a hard look at how this dealership operates, he began. What we do well, what we don't, and what needs to change. The room fell silent, the staff exchanging uncertain glances. Caldwell's gaze swept across the group before settling on Ted. Leadership starts at the top, Caldwell said, his voice firm. And while this dealership has been successful in many ways, I've come to realize that we've also been falling short in areas that matter most. Ted stiffened, his jaw clenching, but he didn't interrupt. Caldwell's attention shifted to Sarah, and his tone softened slightly. Sarah, he said, you embody the kind of values this business should represent. You treat every customer with respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. You go above and beyond, even when it's not easy. And for that, you deserve recognition. Sarah blinked, clearly caught off guard. I'm just doing my job, she stammered. And you're doing it better than anyone else here, Caldwell replied. Which is why, effective immediately, you're being promoted to assistant manager. The announcement sent a wave of murmurs through the staff, and Jacob couldn't help but smile as he saw Sarah's eyes widen in shock. Ted, meanwhile, looked as though he'd been struck. What? Ted snapped, stepping forward. You can't be serious. She's everything this dealership needs, Caldwell interrupted, his voice cutting through Ted's protest. And you, Ted, are everything it doesn't. The room went silent again, the weight of Caldwell's words hanging in the air. Ted's face turned red, his anger barely contained. You're firing me? Ted spat. I'm giving you an opportunity to step down gracefully, Caldwell said. But yes, your time here is over. Ted looked as though he might argue, but the authority in Caldwell's tone left no room for negotiation. He turned and stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. Caldwell turned back to the group. Let this be a lesson, he said. This dealership isn't just about selling cars. It's about how we treat people, our customers, and each other. If you can't meet that standard, this isn't the place for you. Jacob watched as the staff absorbed Caldwell's words, their expressions ranging from shock to quiet approval. Then he caught Sarah's gaze. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Later, as the meeting dispersed and the staff returned to their duties, Sarah approached Jacob. You had something to do with this, didn't you? She asked, her voice soft but firm. Jacob smiled. I might have given Caldwell a little nudge. Sarah shook her head, a small laugh escaping her lips. Why? Because you deserve it, Jacob said simply, and because people like you are rare. For the first time since Jacob had met her, Sarah seemed at a loss for words. She nodded, her smile genuine and warm. Thank you, Jack. Really? Jacob returned the smile, knowing he'd accomplished what he came here to do. As he left the dealership that day, he felt a sense of fulfillment that had nothing to do with wealth or success. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he'd made a real difference. Jacob left the dealership that day feeling lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He hadn't anticipated how deeply this experience would affect him, but seeing Sarah's genuine gratitude and the shift in the dealership's atmosphere had been more rewarding than he could have imagined. The next morning, Jacob woke up early, his mind clear and focused. There was still one final piece of his plan to put into motion. He spent hours making arrangements, ensuring every detail was perfect. He wanted this last gesture to truly matter, not just as a reward for Sarah, but as a message about the values he wanted to uphold and the impact he hoped to leave behind. By mid-afternoon, Jacob returned to Clearwater Motors. This time, he wasn't dressed in his scruffy disguise. He wore a crisp, tailored suit, one that reflected his true identity. As he stepped inside, the staff's reaction was immediate. Whispers rippled through the showroom as employees who had dismissed him days before now watched him with wide-eyed curiosity. Ted, of course, was no longer there. The dealership felt different without his overbearing presence. The atmosphere was lighter, more professional, and at the center of it all was Sarah, standing by the front desk, speaking with a customer. She looked more confident now, her new role already shaping the way she carried herself. When Sarah noticed Jacob, her eyes widened in surprise. She excused herself from the conversation and walked over to him, her expression a mix of confusion and curiosity. Jack? She asked, though her tone was hesitant, as if she wasn't sure that name still applied. Jacob smiled. It's Jacob, actually. Jacob Whitman. Sarah blinked, the pieces falling into place. Whitman as in Whitman Enterprises, Jacob finished. The company that owns half the tech firms on the East Coast. She stared at him, her disbelief clear. You're serious? I am, Jacob said, his tone soft. I came here pretending to be someone else because I wanted to see how people would treat me without knowing who I was. And Sarah, you passed every test? Sarah shook her head slightly, as though trying to process what she was hearing. This is a lot, she admitted. But why? Why go through all this? Jacob's expression grew serious. Because I've spent my life surrounded by people who only care about money and power. I wanted to find someone who cared about more than that, Someone who treated people with kindness, no matter what. And you were that person, Sarah. You are that person. Before she could respond, Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He handed it to her, and she took it hesitantly, her brow furrowing as she opened it. Inside was a letter and a check. As she read the contents, her eyes widened, her hand covering her mouth. "This can't be real," she whispered. "It's very real," Jacob said. "That's a scholarship for you to finish your degree. Fully funded, no strings attached. And the check is to help your family, your mom's medical bills, your brother's education, whatever you need." Tears filled Sarah's eyes, though she blinked them back quickly. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Jacob replied. "You've already said everything through your actions. You've earned this." For a moment, Sarah was silent, her emotions too overwhelming for words. Then she stepped forward and hugged him, the gesture brief but full of gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I won't waste this. I promise." "I know you won't," Jacob said, his voice steady. "That's why I'm doing it." As Jacob turned to leave, Sarah called out, stopping him in his tracks. "Will you be back?" she asked. Jacob paused, glancing over his shoulder with a small smile. "Maybe someday. But you don't need me anymore, Sarah. You've got everything you need to succeed." With that, he walked out of Clearwater Motors, the afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the parking lot. He climbed into his car and drove away, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't about the cars or the dealership. It was about creating change, about rewarding integrity and kindness in a world that often overlooked them. For the first time in years, Jacob felt like he had done something truly meaningful. And as he headed back to his own world, he knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Sarah, but for himself as well. Jacob's drive away from Clearwater Motors felt different. The success of his plan and the changes he had catalyzed stirred a profound sense of clarity in him, but something still lingered. He realized it wasn't just about the dealership or even Sarah's triumph. It was about the broader question of how he could use his resources and influence to make real, tangible change in the lives of others. Back in his penthouse in Manhattan, Jacob settled into his office, the city's skyline stretching out before him like an endless canvas. He stared at the Notepad app on his phone, the notes from his first day at Clearwater still open. The words "plan, push limits tomorrow" stared back at him. Tomorrow had come and gone, and the limits had been pushed. But Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that this experiment had only scratched the surface of what was possible. That night, Jacob made calls. First to Caldwell, to check in on how the changes at Clearwater Motors were progressing. Caldwell reported positive feedback from customers and staff alike. Ted's departure had been a catalyst for a healthier workplace culture, and Sarah was thriving in her new role. Jacob could hear the genuine respect in Caldwell's voice as he spoke of her leadership qualities. His second call was to Sarah. When she picked up, her voice was tinged with curiosity and warmth. "Jacob," she said, her tone steady. "I didn't expect to hear from you so soon." "I wanted to check in," Jacob said. "How's everything going?" Sarah hesitated, then laughed softly. "It's been overwhelming. In a good way. My mom cried when I told her about the scholarship. My brother said I'm his hero now, which is a lot to live up to. But things are good. Really good." "I'm glad to hear that," Jacob replied. "You deserve it." There was a pause before Sarah asked, "What about you? What's next for you, after all of this?" Jacob leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the city lights outside. "That's the question, isn't it?" he said, half to himself. This was never about just one dealership or one person. It was about seeing what could happen if I did more than just sit behind a desk and sign checks. "And," Sarah prompted. "And now I know," Jacob said. "This is just the beginning." The next morning, Jacob drafted a new plan. He wanted to create a foundation dedicated to identifying and supporting individuals like Sarah, people who work tirelessly, often without recognition, to improve the lives of those around them. He envisioned scholarships, mentorship programs, and workplace reform initiatives aimed at fostering cultures of respect and integrity. Within weeks, the framework was in place. The Whitman Foundation was officially launched, With its first initiative aptly named the Sarah Project, Jacob ensured that Sarah herself was featured in the foundation's promotional materials, not as a charity case, but as an example of what true leadership and perseverance looked like. When the foundation's website went live, it featured a simple mission statement: to recognize and empower those who make the world better through kindness, courage, and integrity. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Stories poured in from across the country, highlighting unsung heroes in workplaces, schools, and communities. Jacob personally reviewed many of them, ensuring that the foundation's grants and resources were allocated to those who embodied the values he wanted to champion. Months later, Jacob received a package at his office. Inside was a handwritten letter from Sarah, along with a photo of her standing in front of her first campaign for a community-focused marketing initiative. In the letter, she thanked him again, not just for the opportunities he'd provided, but for believing in her when no one else had. Jacob placed the photo on his desk, next to a framed blueprint of the foundation's logo. It was a reminder of what one person's integrity could inspire, and of the responsibility he now felt to ensure that inspiration spread as far as possible. As he leaned back in his chair, Jacob realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't just building businesses. He was building a legacy. And this time, it wasn't about profits or prestige. It was about people. Months passed, and the Whitman Foundation began making waves nationwide. Jacob found himself busier than ever, but it was a different kind of busy. This wasn't about acquisitions or expansion. It was about people, real stories, real change. The foundation had become a lifeline for individuals like Sarah, people who embodied resilience and integrity but lacked the resources to fully realize their potential. One day, Jacob was in his Manhattan office, reviewing proposals for new initiatives, when his assistant, Ellen, stepped in. "You've got a visitor," she said, her tone laced with curiosity. "Someone you'll want to see." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Send them in." The door opened, and there stood Sarah, her presence both surprising and familiar. She looked different, more confident, more at ease, but her warm smile was unmistakable. She carried a sleek portfolio under one arm, her other hand extended in greeting. "Jacob," she said, "I hope I'm not interrupting." Jacob stood, a grin spreading across his face. "Sarah, what brings you to Manhattan?" She gestured toward the portfolio. "I have a pitch for you." Intrigued, Jacob gestured for her to sit. "You've got my attention. What's the pitch?" Sarah opened the portfolio and laid out a series of documents and graphics. "Since the scholarship and promotion, I've been working on a project at Clearwater Motors. It started small, just a marketing campaign to bring in more local customers. But it's grown into something bigger." Jacob leaned forward, studying the materials. They detailed a plan to turn the dealership into a model for ethical business practices, focusing on community engagement, employee empowerment, and customer service based on respect and inclusivity. "The campaign brought in more families, more first-time buyers," Sarah continued. "But what really stood out were the stories. Customers talked about how they felt welcome, how they weren't judged for what they could or couldn't afford. It's not just about selling cars anymore. It's about changing the way people think about businesses like ours." Jacob glanced up, impressed. "This is incredible, Sarah. You've taken everything we talked about and turned it into something tangible." Sarah smiled, a hint of pride in her expression. "I want to take it further. What if we created a certification program for dealerships across the country? A way to recognize and reward businesses that prioritize integrity, like the Whitman Foundation does for individuals." Jacob leaned back, considering the idea. It was ambitious, but it had potential, real, meaningful potential. "And you want the foundation to help launch this?" Sarah nodded. "I know it's a big ask, but I think it could make a difference. Imagine customers knowing, before they even walk in the door, that they'll be treated with respect. Imagine employees knowing their voices matter. It could change the industry." Jacob didn't hesitate. "Let's do it." Sarah blinked, caught off guard by his immediate agreement. "Just like that?" Jacob grinned. "You've already proven you can make this work on a local level. Now it's time to scale it. The foundation will back you. But this is your project, Sarah. You'll lead it." Her expression shifted from surprise to determination. "Thank you, Jacob. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," he said. "You've never let anyone down." The months that followed were a whirlwind. Sarah threw herself into the project, working closely with Jacob and the Foundations team to develop the certification program. They named it Driven with Integrity, a nod to its roots in the automotive world, but with a mission that extended far beyond it. The program launched with a pilot in 5 states, and the response was overwhelming. Dealerships clamored to be part of the initiative, seeing it as a way to differentiate themselves in a competitive market. Customers embraced it, too, drawn to the promise of an honest, respectful experience. One evening, Jacob found himself at a gala celebrating the program's success. The room was filled with business leaders, community advocates, and foundation beneficiaries, all sharing stories of how the initiative had impacted them. Jacob watched from the sidelines as Sarah took the stage to deliver a speech. She spoke with passion and authenticity, her words resonating with everyone in the room. She shared stories from Clearwater Motors, about customers who had felt seen and valued for the first time, and about employees who now took pride in their work. She ended with a simple message: kindness and integrity aren't just values, they're strategies, and they're the ones worth investing in. As the room erupted into applause, Jacob couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. Not in himself, but in Sarah, and in the movement she was building. This wasn't just a project anymore. It was a revolution, one that was changing industries and lives alike. Later that night, as the gala wound down, Sarah found Jacob by the bar. "Didn't think I'd see you hiding back here," she teased. Jacob laughed. "Just giving you the spotlight. You earned it." Sarah tilted her head, studying him. "You know, none of this would have happened without you." Jacob shook his head. "You were always going to do something extraordinary, Sarah. All I did was clear the path." She smiled, raising her glass. "To clearing paths, and to whatever comes next." Jacob clinked his glass against hers, a sense of fulfillment settling over him. Whatever came next, he knew it would be worth it. Jacob leaned back in his chair, staring at the skyline from his penthouse office. The city buzzed with its usual rhythm, but tonight felt different. The culmination of everything he'd worked for over the past months, his experiment, the Whitman Foundation, and the success of Driven with Integrity, had created a ripple effect that stretched far beyond what he had imagined. Yet, there was still one thing left to do. He had been planning it quietly for weeks, making arrangements behind the scenes. This final gesture wasn't about making headlines or gaining recognition. It was about closing the chapter on Clearwater Motors and ensuring that the place where everything started would never regress to what it once was. A week later, Jacob returned to Clearwater, his appearance a stark contrast to his first day walking into the dealership. This time, he wasn't wearing the disguise of Jack Willis, the unassuming mechanic. He entered as Jacob Whitman, the billionaire who had reshaped the lives of so many. The staff was visibly taken aback as he walked through the glass doors, his confident stride and tailored suit commanding attention. Whispers rippled through the showroom, but Jacob wasn't there for fanfare. His focus was on Sarah, who now stood confidently behind her desk, reviewing paperwork like the true leader she had become. She looked up as he approached, her expression shifting from surprise to warmth. "Jacob," she said, standing to greet him, "what brings you back here?" Jacob gestured for her to sit, taking the chair across from her. "I wanted to make sure everything's running smoothly. How's the team holding up?" Sarah smiled, her confidence evident. "Better than ever. The culture shift has been incredible. People feel heard, respected. Even the customers have noticed the difference. It's a completely new place." Jacob nodded, the confirmation satisfying but not surprising. "I'm glad to hear that. But I'm not just here to check in." Sarah's brow furrowed slightly, her curiosity piqued. "What's going on?" Jacob reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, sliding it across the desk to her. "Open it." She hesitated for a moment before picking it up and carefully pulling out the contents. Inside was a contract, one that left her speechless. "This," she began, her voice trailing off as she scanned the pages. "This says I'm the owner?" Jacob smiled. "That's right. I've finalized the paperwork to transfer full ownership of Clearwater Motors to you. It's yours now, Sarah." She looked up at him, her expression a mix of shock and disbelief. "Why would you do this?" You've already done so much. Jacob leaned forward, his tone soft but firm. Because this place needs someone like you. Someone who values people over profits. Someone who understands what it means to lead with integrity. Clearwater Motors wouldn't be where it is today without you. And I know it'll thrive with you at the helm. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away, shaking her head as though trying to process the weight of what he'd just said. I don't even know what to say. Say you'll take it, Jacob said simply, and promise me you'll keep building on what you've started here. She nodded slowly, a small but determined smile breaking through. I promise. The two sat in silence for a moment, the significance of the moment settling between them. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice steady. I'll make this place something to be proud of. For the employees, the customers, and for people like you who believed in me. Jacob stood, offering his hand. I don't doubt that for a second. Sarah took his hand, shaking it firmly. Thank you, Jacob, for everything. As Jacob left the dealership for the last time, he felt a sense of closure. Clearwater Motors was in the right hands, and the foundation he'd built was thriving. He had started this journey searching for authenticity in others, but along the way, he'd rediscovered his own purpose. It wasn't just about money or success. It was about creating opportunities, recognizing integrity, and leaving the world better than he found it. As he climbed into his car and drove away, Jacob knew he wouldn't be back anytime soon. He didn't need to be. Clearwater Motors and Sarah were ready to carry the torch forward, ensuring that kindness, integrity, and respect would always be at the heart of their story. And for Jacob, that was enough. Now tell me, how would you treat someone who seems to have nothing to offer? This story shows us that integrity and empathy can change lives. And if you enjoyed this journey, don't miss the next videos on the channel. There's plenty of inspiration and powerful lessons coming your way. Are you ready for the next story?